Welcome to the Rhino Resilience Podcast. I'm Chris Rhino Swenson. This is where we build calm strength, grounded resilience, and the mindset to carry what life throws at us, especially in rural life. Let's get into it. Okay, welcome back to the Rhino Resilience Podcast. Today we have another guest on, and as usual, I'd like to thank a lot of the people out there who have been calling in or writing in and giving me their support. So feel free to share it, like it, all those kind of things. And before we get started today, we'll get into our weekly oopsie tootsie question of the week. And this week, the question becomes who is someone that has made an influence on your life? And for me, who that person is I always look back, there's a lot of different people, obviously. But one that usually kind of stands out to me would be Abraham Lincoln. For whatever reason, he kind of came into my life and I began studying, and I've read everything you can and follow a lot of his ideas. But I mean, there's been a lot of other people, obviously my parents and my wife and kids and things like that. But usually things go back to Abraham Lincoln among many others. So Ashley, who might be that person for you? Or
Oh my gosh. I was thinking, please don't ask me that question. I never know how to answer. I think different walks of life, different phases of life, so many people come into our lives and influence us in different ways. So, yeah, I think I could name, dozens based on just different things. But I think on a personal level, um, I feel like my grandmother had a really big impact on my life. I feel like I'm very much like her. My mom as well. I think just the women that came before me, especially the older I get, you start to see the generations before yourself showing up in yourself. So, certainly a positive, loving, compassionate, kind of nurturing impact from my grandmother and my mom. I think that's where I get a lot of my own nurturing qualities from.
nice, yes. So there's our weekly question. So yeah, I appreciate people writing in and asking those. So keep that coming from there. But yes, today we have a special guest on, Ashley Bendiksen. And so feel free just to kind of introduce yourself and kind of offer kind of just a little bit of an introduction, and then maybe get kind of into your kind of backstory, what led you to do what you do.
Sure. So I work full time as a kind of nationally touring speaker and trainer. My business centers on topics of domestic violence, teen dating violence, adolescent adverse experiences, early childhood adverse experiences, and trauma resilience. And I know it's a lot of topics, but there's a red thread through all of them. And essentially, what I do in my work is I travel and I do everything from school assemblies to teacher professional development, training professionals who work in victim services, professionals who work with youth on kind of how to not just prevent harm, but also intervene early and implement strategies to help people who have been impacted to rebuild resilience and essentially move forward and thrive in their lives. And this all comes from, which is probably no surprise to anyone listening, my own personal experiences. I struggled a lot as a teenager, kind of between the ages of 14 to 20. I was in a lot of abusive dating relationships, which led to a lot of secondary traumas and challenges. And later in life, as I was rebuilding, one of the things I felt really called to do was just to kind of get involved, to help raise awareness about some of the issues that I had experienced. And those early days of just kind of volunteering and giving back and showing up at awareness events, it ended up changing the trajectory of my life and my career. I was given a chance to speak, and this just kind of became my soapbox cause, was raising awareness, promoting social justice, and eventually I went back to school for criminal justice, and my whole career now has been victim services and advocacy and primary prevention, thus making me now an expert. And I've been speaking for, my gosh, 18 years, which is kind of crazy. And I love what I do. It's needed work, as you very well know, with everything that you're doing, which is, we have very similar missions.
Yeah, no, I think that you've made quite a bit of difference in a lot of people's lives, it seems like, because you're out there on the road quite a bit doing a lot of those things. And it seems like a great thing when you're able to take something that you went through and to be able to then use that in a way that now you can give back and maybe help people out that were in similar situations, now and things like that. But how does that kind of happen, like full circle for you? How do you feel about some of those things?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because when I first started out, I didn't really know that that's what I was doing. When I was asked to speak, it was for a community vigil. I knew they needed a survivor speaker, and I just remembered thinking, if I speak and if I tell my story, I'm going to be judged. What will this mean? What will my community think? What will these strangers think of me? Just all of the fears. But the response after that first speech I ever gave was solidarity. People coming up and saying, "This was me, this was my loved one. Thank you. I went through this and I didn't even know that that's what this was." And that experience has just happened residually since. Every speech, there's at least one person that might disclose to me. And then sometimes months later, I get a message from a student who heard me speak. So it means a lot to me. I think I never set out thinking I'm gonna like change people's lives or save people's lives. I just thought people need to talk about this stuff, right? Like the heaviest and most difficult issues we face often, persist because no one's talking about them. And so, yeah, I feel very grateful to do what I do and to have the strength to kind of keep talking about this issue and, to derive strength from this work because it is difficult, but I always think, especially when I speak to students, like this is the talk I needed, right? So that's that full circle moment is, what could hearing this have done for me? What could this caring adult have done if I had known them when I was a teen? So it's all connected for sure.
Yeah, I know that one of the areas that a lot of people are not aware of, like out here in rural areas, that domestic violence is a big thing. And for a lot of people, they're isolated. There might not be a lot of supports, a lot of that's out there. But what are things that, you've either learned or been through to kind of describe or to help people that might be out there? What kind of advice might you have, or kind of words of wisdom, if you will?
Yeah, I think there's often, still this myth or this image in our minds of what domestic violence looks like and who it impacts, but no community and, no group of people are immune to these issues. I mean, I've, personally interacted with cases where the offender was, very successful, top of a major institution. So, this happens in communities all over. And I think, something really helpful, um, and I think there's more dialogue about it these days, is that domestic violence is not necessarily just physical violence. In most cases, it's a dynamic where there's such a power imbalance in a relationship. And the person that kind of has the upper hand, so to speak, uses a lot of tactics to just have kind of what we would call coercive control over their partner, over the kids, over the family decisions at the expense of everyone's mental well being, sense of safety, agency, autonomy. So, it could be a partner who's extremely financially controlling, doesn't allow their partner to work. It could be a partner who's very verbally abusive and harmful and plays lots of mind games and kind of causes constant psychological harm. And that is trauma, right? It's this emotional psychological trauma that really hurts people, and for many people that's just all they know. It's what's normal to them. It's just that's their relationship. But I think it's important that we give language to these things. That healthy relationships are built on respect and autonomy, and both partners having agency and a voice and feeling safe to express oneself. So I think step one is just understanding it's more than just physical harm. And two, that there's resources. And sometimes it's just a matter of starting the conversation with a confidential advocate or a hotline to say, I have some red flags, some things feel off in my relationship. I feel trapped. What can I do about it? And it can be more challenging in rural communities, which I'm sure you've encountered, because, either everybody knows each other and that creates a barrier. And often people who are controlling at home are very charming out in the real world. Or maybe, the person that is harming you wears a bunch of hats in the community. And there's just a lot of dynamics that Yeah, create even more barriers to kind of recognizing that you might need some support or even asking for help.
Yeah, wonderful. But I look at too, like when it's reaching out, that's got to be there's a lot of stigma around reaching out for like mental health or substance stuff. But around this, I mean, what has been your kind of understanding of things when a person's like, maybe I am starting to see some of those signs and I need to reach out, but maybe there's some nervousness about that. I'm not sure. What could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is the stigma. I think no one wants to even believe for themselves that they are with a person who might be an offender or an abusive person. They weren't probably that when you first met them. So I think there's a lot of just denial, and kind of having a hard time even admitting it to yourself. And then, to say it out loud is very challenging. People are afraid they're not going to be believed, right? It's very common. Survivors don't expect people to believe them. So there's that. But also, I think when it comes to kind of abusive and unhealthy relationships, there's also a lot of tangible barriers too. I mentioned financial abuse. If you haven't been allowed to work and you have no credit card, no savings account, and no access to financial resources, that becomes a challenge, right? You might feel like, I don't even know where to begin. Or if I try to leave, they're going to threaten to take the children. Or every time I've tried to leave the relationships, they say that they're going to report me for, my drinking, or there's just so many factors at play. Um, or a person's identity might even affect, whether they feel comfortable asking for help or knowing where to go for support. So, um, I think all those barriers and countless others are valid, which is why I often tell people to kind of use those confidential anonymous hotlines just as a start, just to be empowered with some information. And because of the work that I do, I'm a firm believer now that there are always resources for anyone, no matter their situation or the barriers they think they face. It just might be much harder to access those resources, but they are out there. So, state hotlines are great. Community resources are often confidential, and it's just a matter of kind of finding the safety to just have that conversation and get some information.
Yeah, no, in my experience too, when I've worked with people in those situations where it is like a multifaceted thing where I know I need to get out, but the number of things that need to be in place for that becomes where we sometimes start like, okay, what's step one, and making it very, very more simple as far as like maybe I need to find some way of having transportation, or I mean, just different things, whatever those barriers become, that are on there. And so I think each person's journey becomes different, where I think there's always that thing out there where people are just like, why don't you just leave? And I think that there's a lot more to it that a lot of people don't understand. Is that kind of your same feeling too, or?
Absolutely. I think until you've lived it, it's really hard to, have the understanding of how hard it feels to leave someone who is that controlling, or that volatile or unpredictable. A lot of victims of abuse will say, they just never really knew how their partner would react. So there's always this what if? What if they respond really violently or aggressively? For anybody who needs power in a relationship, the ultimate loss of power is your partner trying to leave you. And many victims will know that it can be very dangerous. So, that's part of it. And, I think for many, sometimes it feels like staying is just easier than leaving. You start to know your partner's patterns. You start to know how to kind of calm them down, how to get through each day, how to make sure that you can just go to bed and feel safe and wake up and hope tomorrow is better. And sometimes that feels much easier than the process of trying to leave them, because you just learn to be in management mode, survival mode, and it becomes your status quo. So sometimes that just feels easier. So it's very hard to understand if you haven't been through it.
Yeah, no, that's just the whole thing. And I start to think about where a lot of people that are in those situations that, it's a struggle. Almost they talk about like trauma bonds and things like that, where those things are something that a lot of people don't even understand what that is. And there gets to be that tie where people sometimes are in love with the person, but it's more of the view or the thought of how they might be, and then they stay in a lot of that. What has been your experience around trauma bonds, or have you talked about those things? And could you share some things about that?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of codependence that happens. There is a lot of trauma bonding that happens in these types of relationships. Many times an abusive or, emotionally abusive partner will kind of brainwash you into feeling like you will not find anyone else. No one will ever care for you. So you do feel emotionally dependent on this person in addition to maybe the financial dependence. So yeah, it's like psychological warfare in many different ways. And your body and your mind in many ways you just kind of become conditioned to be in that type of environment, and some people actually don't know how to function outside of a high toxic stress environment or relationship too. So that becomes part of like that trauma bonding piece where you're just conditioned kind of for these highs and lows and kind of extreme behaviors all the time where healthy feels boring or to separate, you end up doing something else destructive. So yeah, it's complex.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because people have that where they're like so conditioned to be in that high, stressful, toxic environment where it's almost as if that becomes like a thermostat in the room where that was their normal. And when that's not there, like your brain is always like, okay, this is different, and it feels abnormal when actually it's not. Um, but could you kind of share some things too that when people are finally away, one thing I've noticed is getting that nervous system reset back to kind of a more normal thing where for a long time it's quite up on edge. Are there like strategies, ideas, or just thoughts you have about some of that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say that there's any one or two things that really works because I think healing and re-regulating and um, learning to manage your own triggers and stress responses is so personalized to each person. Some people swear by talk therapy. Others need things like EMDR, yoga, things that are more somatic and in the body. The idea of mindfulness is kind of, all encompassing where a lot of these modalities fall under that, whether that's breath work or things like yoga, dance therapy. I just went to a great conference presentation on like drama and theater as therapy. So I think, it's always going to be individual for each person. Healing is a journey, right? And it's trying on different things and seeing what works for you. But just to kind of go back to the heart of the question, when you're in a constant state of potential threat or you're always on edge, your body physically responds, right? Your heart increases, your heart rate. You're just kind of poised to either fight or right flee or fawn, right, and comply and do whatever you can in those moments. And it's a lot to kind of learn that you can just feel calm and grounded in your body. And, for each person, the tools that work for them will be different, which is why I think, advocates and trained therapists are just so important to kind of guide you through that process and introduce you, hopefully, to different types of tools and techniques.
Yeah, great. Because I can totally relate because, I've been diagnosed with PTSD, but not for any of like domestic violence type things. It was a lot different, but I've had that where what I thought was normal, like they hooked me up to one of those things to see where my stress level was at, and it just went right off the charts. And so I did all these breathing things, all this stuff, what they were telling me to do, like for 5 minutes, and I felt great. I'm like, I think this is much better. I hooked myself back up again, and I was off the charts again. And I was like, I just got so used to that being normal. But once I did it again for 5 minutes, because I'm very competitive, so I knew I was going to win this time. And I worked really hard, but it finally got down a little bit. But over the years, it's much easier. It's just when it rears its ugly head from time to time, then it takes me a while to get everything back set. But I think you're right, where I've learned, even for me, just the specific things that work for me. And it may not work for everybody, but you're just finding those other aspects. So, no, I was glad that you shared that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, ultimately it's training yourself to know like I'm in the present moment, right? Like the thing that I feel is in the room with me right now isn't. It's an imprint of an old experience or an old memory. And so, we're always going to have triggers, right? Like you, I do as well sometimes, and I've built the skills to recognize when it's happening and to use something that'll help me just reground and remember I'm in the present moment and I'm safe and that threat is not real or here. It's just a little memory that's popping back up throughout my system. And now I know how to, kind of calm it down and put it back into the archives.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm very aware as well for my triggers and things, and sometimes it just pops up. And so I'll take some deep breaths, and the people around me, if they're not aware of what I'm doing, they're like, "Are you really mad or something?" Because you're just doing those deep breaths, and I'm like, "No, no, no, I'm good." Maybe I'll
Yep.
step outside, whatever it might be, different
Yep.
things like that. But yeah, but now I want to switch gears a little bit here and kind of offer some things about youth. And you talk a lot about like youth and relationships and what healthy relationships look like, and sharing some of those red flags, perhaps. Could you share some of those things?
Absolutely. So, when we talk about something like domestic violence or toxic relationships or emotional abuse, whatever we want to call it, it occurs across the lifespan, right? Kids are in homes where they see this among family members. It happens to adults. But, I think kind of this unaddressed area, this demographic is teenagers. The statistics around teens who are in dating violence relationships are extremely high. It outweighs the number of kids who experience bullying. In the US, 1 in 3 teenagers self reports, experiencing some type of abuse in a dating relationship before they turn 18, which is really concerning because our relationships impact our sense of self, our mental health, our physical well being, our choices, right? How we direct our lives. And as a teenager or an adolescent, your life is so social. So when the people around you are unhealthy or toxic or manipulative, those formative years can be forever altered, right? Um, at a time when kids really should just be self exploring and being their authentic selves. And it's not even just unhealthy dating partners. With all the work that I do, countless students will come up and tell me stories of their best friend kind of checking all of those same boxes. So, what does that look like? Well, again, it's not typically physical, it's often verbal and emotional. It's that like very controlling dynamic where there's this one person has all the power and the other just feels like they're trapped or have to say yes to everything or can't say no or there's just a myriad of things. And often when it comes to teens, some of the ones that I teach when I give my assemblies or talk to parents, very early on, there's a lot of isolation. So maybe the new dating partner doesn't like that I have friends of my own, doesn't like that I have these hobbies and extracurriculars that they're not involved in. And kind of slowly but subtly, they will distance me from my friends, my family members, commitments that I'd normally have. And, behind closed doors, I'm kind of dealing with their insecurities about it or whatever they're saying. But slowly I'm being cut off, right? So a lot of times parents will kind of see this. Their child's no longer doing the things they used to love, and it could be because of the new partner. A toxic best friend or a toxic dating partner can be very controlling about not just who their friends are, but what they wear, what clubs they can join at school. A big thing these days is technology and like devices and being controlling about that. So, in the world of youth dating, the new norm is that when you're dating, you should share your locations now. It's like become so normalized that kids don't realize that they can say no to something like that. So, that becomes a tool for one partner to kind of know where their partner is at all times. And I've heard stories of, a kid being away at a soccer meet and the bus takes him to get pizza and the partner's really mad and shows up at the pizza place and they're saying, "Why are you here?" And what are you doing? So there's a lot of location monitoring, demanding access to someone's phone passwords. Let me see your messages, delete all these people on Instagram. And again, a friend can do that stuff too. And then just, the usual lots of mind games and manipulation and belittling and using your insecurities against you to make you feel small. And then often just kind of these extreme behaviors where, 1 minute's good and then the next minute there's a big fight and then they apologize and then it gets better. And, you put all this together, and that is a poisonous combination for your mental health, your well-being, your physical health. And these things are not, rare. I mean, I tell my story and I share these things, and the kids are nodding their heads and they're pointing at each other and like, look at that one. But sadly, these kind of toxic behaviors have just become normalized. So yeah, yeah, it's huge. It's huge among teens. And I think this is why I like to speak to students. It's also why I think that parents and adults just need to kind of have these conversations as early as possible with young people about what's healthy and what to do if something feels off, right?
Yeah, I like what you said, where it's things are so normalized on some of these behaviors. And I think that's where people miss a lot of different things going on because they don't know. I think in your work, when you kind of help point those things out for them, that becomes a very valuable aspect for that. Are there like certain like, because I know when people, I tell people like, how do you know if you're in kind of a abusive relationship at first? And I tell them that you're not going to know like right away. I mean, a lot of times they're going to be charming. They're going to be buying you flowers. They're going to be doing whatever. It's just a slowly gradual deal. And sometimes I don't know if it's like testing behaviors or what that they might do where there's just something that goes on that they see how you respond and they start taking some more ground. But are there some kind of like early telltale signs or different things that you have for some of those people out there or younger people where like maybe there's something with their gut? I don't know. What might you say about those things or
I think it's hard to tell because some of the potential red flags could also go nowhere, right? We talk often about the concept of being love bombed in the beginning, where,
Mhm.
there's words of affirmation and these big showings of affection and maybe an exciting date really early on, or they're already putting you on their social media. Or if you're a kid, that stuff means so much. They might want a relationship really quickly. They're saying, I've never met anyone like you before. And those are like yellow flags. That's like, all right, that's lovely, but it could be love bombing. So let's just give this time, right? Let's not rush. But those behaviors could show up and someone could be a completely lovely partner and maybe you spend forever with them. So, I'm often telling kids like, if your partner is a little bit insecure, if they're a little bit jealous, if they're starting to try to change you or make decisions for you, those are little red flags. And all you do is give it time. And in life, we have to assess every relationship. And we do that on month one. We do that on month six. We do it again on year one because people change, right? That is just the reality. No one's awful in the beginning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have brought them into our circle. So people change over time. And this is where it takes a lot of social courage and personal courage to maybe have tough conversations when, you start to realize there are real red flags. But we just have to assess over time because you're right. It's the beginning doesn't always have those clear and obvious red flags that would make all of this much easier.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is I've worked with people that were friends. Like they see a friend who's going through this and they try to talk to them, but it doesn't quite get through. I mean, what are there some suggestions, ideas that you talk about related to that as far as if they have somebody out there who like, wow, I mean, this friend of mine, she or he's in one of these relationships and how do I talk to them? I don't want to upset them. I don't want to bother, like this, but they really do care about them.
Mm. Yeah, I get this question a lot. And I think first and foremost, probably a mistake that I hear quite often is people get really frustrated trying to encourage someone to break up, to leave, and they're not listening. And often what happens is it creates a rift in the friendship, and then you're no longer friends. And I get it. It's so hard. It is so devastating to have to bear witness to. But if we, as the friend and the loved one, do leave, we are supporting what the abusive partner wants, which is to isolate the person they're dating. They love when we're ticked off and we're done and we're fed up and we are out of the picture. So it's important just to stay present, and stay patient and realize that you might not be able to do or say anything. Because even if a person knows that they should leave and they're agreeing with you, it doesn't mean it's that easy. But I think one little thing that is sometimes helpful is a lot of friends and loved ones will point out all the bad things that they don't like. I don't like how he does this. I don't like how she does that. They shouldn't be doing this. And any victim is just going to go on the defense in those moments. They're going to say, you don't understand. You don't see it. We're working on it. It's still just an issue with work right now. There's a lot of stress. They will always defend. So stop talking about their partner. Just talk about them. And I think it can be really helpful to get someone to self reflect on maybe how they're being impacted. So rather than saying, your partner shouldn't tell you you can't go to, the art club anymore, say, you used to love art and I noticed that you kind of dropped out of the club. Is everything okay? Or, hey, you used to join us every Saturday morning for yoga. Is everything all right? Get someone to kind of self reflect because sometimes that's more powerful than pointing out all those red flags. We should say that's a red flag. We should say that sounds controlling, but that conversation at a certain point is done and they're not going to be receptive to it. And when you know that that's not working anymore, just focus on them or just stay a steady presence in their life because when that day comes, hopefully they will then turn to you because they're going to know that you haven't judged them or are not going to say I told you so. You just have to kind of stay patient and present.
No, wonderful ideas. And it got me to thinking too, because I asked about like friends when they notice it and how to do that. But it got me thinking where as parents, I mean, are there certain things that they might start noticing or seeing, but then how do they bring that conversation up? Because I know for a lot of teens, they'll talk more with their friends than they will with their parents, but not always. But I know as parents, you begin to see some of that. And there's that line I know for me when my kids were younger, that they started dating and you were like, I know this isn't the right person for her, but she's got to figure that out. But I don't think it was like aggressive or controlling, but I think for her, it was more smothering, which I didn't think she was going to really like, but she eventually had to figure it out. But what are those things like for parents that they might be able to reach those conversations with people or what things to look for?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, adolescence is one of those ages where now there's a balance between how much you step in, because part of, those formative years is to develop a sense of independence and self-mastery and autonomy and make some mistakes, right? You empower your kids by allow them to make the bad choice sometimes. But anytime we have safety concerns, I think parents have a right to step in. And I think what kids need in those moments is, again, not to feel judged. They don't want to feel like they're being misunderstood, going to get in trouble, going to get someone else in trouble. I always tell parents if you have concerns, lead with compassion, curiosity, open ended questions. Just mention something that you've noticed and ask them if everything's okay and just be transparent and honest rather than kind of like disappointed or frustrated or angry with them, which can sometimes be our emotional response. I think teenagers really appreciate transparency and honesty. And most importantly, they just never want to feel judged. And just remembering that kind of when you go into conversations does change your approach and how you show up. But I also think that, I think the more we can just have conversations with our kids at an even earlier age, conversations with them when they're teenagers become more natural. If you're somebody who doesn't really have conversations with your child very often, what makes you think that suddenly at 14 they're going to come open up about some big life issue? So, I'll tell parents like, maybe your 9-year old has a new video game and they're obsessed with it and you have no idea, you just don't get it. Just ask them about it. Like, spend longer than necessary talking about little, trivial, unimportant things because they're going to know you're someone who can talk and who can hold space for a conversation. So, when the big issues later in life show up, hopefully they already kind of have that natural rapport with you. I didn't have a lot of conversations with my parents growing up. And so when those big things did happen, I didn't think that I could talk to them about it. The few times I tried to talk to them about life issues, they were very quickly dismissed. So I didn't have kind of that feeling or sense that they'd be helpful. So yeah, we can't start like early enough, just having those everyday meaningful conversations to set up for, future ones.
And I know that you recently wrote a children's book and it's on like boundaries. And so it kind of fits what you were just saying, like we can't have these conversations early enough. I would love to hear more about your book, or at least I know about it, but it's to share kind of to let the listeners know about your book and what kind of led to that and what the information kind of is. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So it just came out April of this year, 2026. So it's very new at the time of this recording. But it is called A Kid's Book About Boundaries. And it's part of a pretty popular existing kids' book series. Great collection. There's books on all kinds of topics, and they're all titled A Kid's Book About fill in the blank. Racism, neurodivergence, divorce, failure, anger, right? Big emotions. They're just a really great book series. And the books are designed to kind of spark these early conversations. The bulk of my work is in schools, and the reason I love it so much is because, again, I think prevention starts young, right? I love the response and, best practices in different, industries there. But for me, getting ahead of these issues is powerful. So when my speaking agent said, "Hey, would you want to write a children's book to reach even younger kiddos?" It was an easy yes. Because one of the things I believe is that, we don't need to teach a 5-year-old about dating violence, but we can teach them about healthy friendships, right? We can take these big topics and boil them down to these foundational life skills. And, for me, the concept of having a voice, being able to speak up if something felt off, to say the words no to situations that didn't feel right, that didn't exist for me as a teenager. It doesn't exist for a lot of people, even as grown adults. So, the book essentially aims to teach kids as young as 5 years old that in life you have a right to feel safe, and that you can use your voice and speak up if anything doesn't feel right. And there's really kid-friendly examples in it, like someone takes your toy without asking first, or someone makes jokes about you that you don't really feel that good about or think are funny, right? So just very kid-friendly examples. I put some kind of scripts in there, like you can say this or you can say this, so they can start to practice saying no thank you or please ask me first next time. And it teaches them to respect others' boundaries too. So I'm pretty excited. The book is doing extremely well. I think the title itself is just why the book is doing so well. I mean, I, of course, feel that I wrote it in a very effective way, but it's a topic that I think people are like, yes, I needed this book when I was 5. So, yeah, it's been really lovely to kind of share it with my community. It's through Penguin Random House, so it's in all major bookstores if anyone wants to find it. Um, but yeah, it's been a really great experience, and I love being able to reach kids even younger.
Yeah, no, I love it because my wife is going to love this part because she's in early childhood and she continues, she'll joke with people and say, if I do my job, then my husband will not have a job, you know?
Hmm.
Um, but we were at an event talking about mental health recently, and I was up on a panel and we kept talking all about this, mainly about adults, this stuff. And she was getting worked up out there. And she finally brought it up as a question like, we need to talk about early childhood. And so, yes, I think having these conversations, bringing it to younger kids to let them know about some of those basic stuff that it begins to build that going into the future, like the prevention stuff, like you said. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, hopefully these are, what we would say are preventative factors, but also protective factors, right? Just the ability to use your voice in life is going to serve you in many different ways. So, yeah, I am with your wife, and I also would love to like put myself out of business. That would be a much better world to live in, but until then, I'll keep I'll keep working.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. So when we look to kind of get toward the close here, I mean, what are some of the things that you kind of leave people with, or some of the, I don't know, your top kind of things that you want to let people know that might be out there kind of struggling with some of the things we talked about today? What do you kind of want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're experiencing this, you're certainly not alone. And that might sound like a really cliched response, but it does always feel so isolating, like it's just you. It feels like I used to think my situation is so unique and so complex and no one can understand, and this is just me. But there are people that understand. And you do deserve more. You deserve to feel safe and supported. And that's not just physically safe, that's emotionally safe. And there is another world on the other side of this world that you've been living, as hard as that feels to imagine. But I, for one, feel that my life has expanded in ways that I never might have experienced otherwise, because now on the other side of it, I do advocate for myself. I do set strong boundaries and therefore have healthy people in my life, have experiences that are meaningful. My life was so small that now I live in a bigger, more abundant way. Step one is just starting the conversation with someone, doing so in a safe space. People can help with safety planning. There are resources out there. And then for kind of everybody else, whether you're a parent or you are a teacher, an educator, someone who works with youth or works with victims, you're also not alone. And there's resources to support you in the strategies and approaches that you should take. And there's also peers and colleagues and communities that you can join to make sure you're also practicing self-care in these spaces too, because it is difficult navigating whether it's a loved one or the clients you serve at your job. We're in this together, and this movement is growing, and it's growing bigger and more public, which is great to see every day. Never feel like there isn't something out there to support you with whatever you need.
Perfect. Yeah. So how can people like reach out or kind of get in contact with you or things like that if they need to?
Yeah, the easiest thing to do is just to search my name. You will find my website. It's ashleybendiksen.com. All of my speaking programs are on there. My kids' book is on there, or you can just search a kids' book about boundaries. But if you look up my name, you'll find whatever you need to find.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's been an honor again to visit with you once again. And I just want to share with all the listeners out there too that having listened to this today, if this kind of hit home for you, or you recognize something within yourself, or maybe you've somebody else around you, that feel free to share this, feel free to reach out, share this with other people as well. And I'm hoping that a lot of the things we talked about today can help that one person out there. As I always say, I'll get in a room of a bunch of people and speak, and it's like might reach that one person is what I usually look to do. So, but now we're going to look to wrap up for today. So yes, feel free to share all these things. So with that, stay steady. We're in this together.